Well, Masters of the Universe is about to get its first non-Caucasian, non-fishy, skull-face, monstrous, beast-manish character. And yeah, that's, if you hadn't told by this sign, it's Jitsu. And it just kind of makes the whole political correctness alarm go off. But you know what? That's his name, and he's the Masters of the Universe character with the giant golden glove with all the cool jewels in it. And I don't know, tends to we see that motif a lot in pop culture, don't we? But yep, nope, not talking about Thanos. We are talking about Jitsu, and yes, it does look like Jitsu has the Infinity Gauntlet. I'm not just going to play around with that. And hey, the original Infinity Gauntlet actually also all had green stone. So, ooh, maybe there's some weird connection there. I don't know. So, Jitsu, main character, major character in Masters of the Universe, following up Ram Man in the Classics line, which was cool because we got to release two big name characters in a row at the beginning of 2013, which is always great because the main characters always sell the best and get the most sort of publicity. And, Ram Man being a big guy, Jitsu is back to a normal-sized figure. But as normal-sized as he is, he's definitely not normal-sized as far as fan, audience, if you will, because he is a big fan favorite. He's one of those characters that came out smack in the middle of the line in 84, 83, 84, so he wasn't a early figure or a late figure, but, kind of right there in the prime of things. And while a lot of people do give credit to Filmation, he was created by Mattel. Filmation did adapt him for one episode before, as I said, with political correctness sign in the beginning, they felt that the name, the character and his name, Chopper, not quite what they wanted in the show. But that name and the character does come from Mattel, from their story addendum that they put out in 1983 for the 84 line. I actually did a whole reading of this addendum a couple weeks ago in a video. You can check it out. But yeah, it introduces the character, Chopper, having a right hand that's enormous.
I am tired of these jokes about my giant hand. The first such incident occurred in 1956.
So yes, while he was at first Chopper, it does note that those names were not final, and it was changed to Jitsu in later material. But for the Filmation series, they started going with the original name of Chopper, since that's, early development, and a lot of times when cartoons are being designed, it's going off early material. But like I said, Jitsu or Chopper only made it into one episode. Although, no, he had a human hand, not a gold hand, in the episode. And they did make a figure of him, they being Super 7, when they continued the Grayskull line. Noting, again, his human hand, not his gold hand, but, still huge and giant, and, you could take a lot of notes on it, like that guy from The Simpsons. So, cool, and they did name him Chopper in that for that figure. But the vintage action figure, pure Jitsu. That's how he was known, that was how he, made it into the hearts of many, many He-Man fans, and like I said, being a sort of middle figure, the evil master of martial arts, came out right when the line was sort of at the peak of its popularity. So, yeah, a lot of people wound up having Jitsu and his gold or eventually silver arm when the gold fades to silver after years, because that's what happens sometimes with VAC metal. But yes, it was supposed to be gold. And it had an action feature. Same action feature as Fisto, where you would basically take the arm and hold it up and it would come down in a chop. Fisto had the same mechanism, it was just you'd be encouraged to punch, but Jitsu could do the punch and Fisto could do the chop. It was the same mechanism in both. He was a basic figure using the basic human body. He just had the mechanism, the sword, and new armor. And speaking of Fisto, he was very much framed as the arch enemy as Fisto, both in official merchandise, and this was a design for licensing, like for t-shirts, as well as actually in the toy line and some of the ways the figures were advertised in the catalog and in packouts and in the mini-comics. Very few characters in Masters of the Universe sort of had an arch-enemy. I mean, Skeletor versus He-Man, obviously, but I don't think you could really name Merman's arch-enemy. And Jitsu, that made him kind of cooler. Plus, he had a mount. He was one of the very few characters, again, outside Hordak, Skeletor, He-Man, to have his own mount. Now, I'm talking about Night Stalker, who originally was designed to be Skeletor's. The idea was Skeletor was going to upgrade, I guess, from Panther to a robotic horse. And there was a lot of material, both from the catalogs and some of the artwork that was done for the toy product. Gorgeous artwork. I really need to do a video just about how gorgeous all this artwork was in the 80s for the toys. But as much as putting Skeletor on top of a giant robotic horse was part of the long-term plan, that's not how it wound up. And while there was a lot of design work and material done, and heck, you can even still buy a Funko Pop of Skeletor on Night Stalker. When you say one thing, you mean your mother. Freudian slip. So Night Stalker was originally packaged not only as Skeletor's evil armored battle steed, but he was packaged by himself as a standalone horse. When he became Jitsu's horse for reasons, well, there was a brand new SKU and a brand new pack out for a deluxe version, if you will, at a higher price point, where you could get Jitsu riding Stridor. And that also sort of played into the whole Jitsu versus Fisto thing, since the good guy horse, Stridor, was unofficially Fisto's. So here was the actual Stridor and Fisto 2-pack, where you could... did I say Fisto? I don't even know what I'm talking about anymore. Jitsu, Fisto, Jitsu, and Night Stalker. There he is. See, Jitsu is the guy with the golden arm. Fisto's the guy with the silver fist. Oh, they're same mechanism. You can see why I mix them up in my head. I can't even do anything anymore. It's not the years, it's the mileage. So, anyway, he had a horsey, and it's cool, because he had a horsey, and he had an archenemy, and that made him really cool, because, yeah, again, like, there's not many other archenemies, and characters that have their own mount. Hordak has, his, and He-Man and Skeletor, but that's about it. So, that's big reason why Jitsu became such a fan favorite, I think, because there was sort of a natural storytelling and drama around him, with him and Fisto sharing the same action feature. Now, unfortunately, it wasn't enough to get him into the 2000X series, but there were plans, there were drawings, there were designs of what he was going to look like, and he was going to be introduced in the 3rd season as a new character for the show. But like so many, great plans of mice and men, Jitsu never made it into the 2000X show. He did make it into the Origins line. In fact, as of this video, which is going up in, December 2021, I record them a little bit earlier than they actually go up, he's just hitting shelf, so that's cool. You can get Jitsu updated into that line. And you could, of course, get Jitsu updated into Classics, which is why we're making this video in the first place. Now, he was a relatively easy figure to do, but there were some plans that he was actually supposed to be even easier to do than he was, as far as a costing standpoint, in the way he was plotted out on what's called the P&L, the profit and loss statement, and every figure had sort of tooling allocation, where you had your tooling pool for the year, and figures would get it accordingly to what they needed, and we had to estimate that. And then when the figure actually got designed and sculpted by the Four Horsemen, sometimes they would come in cheaper, sometimes a little bit more expensive, depending on how they executed the figure. And with Jitsu, this was one of those cases where we actually planned on the figure having fewer new parts than the Horsemen actually gave him. And he didn't necessarily break the bank, but it meant that some of the things that we had planned for him, we couldn't do. And I'll get into that in a moment, but first let's kind of appreciate the beauty that is the Jitsu figure that the Horsemen sculpted. So obviously he's got his original vintage sword, and then they gave him 2 extra blade weapon things, which I'm sure have an official name, and people will say that in the comments, that much like Grizzlor, who came before him, one of the brilliant things the Horsemen did was they came up with really cool ways to attach extra weapons to a figure. And that's sort of the crux of what happened with Jitsu's tooling, is we weren't planning on this. Originally, the plan was that Jitsu was going to have the same armor as King Randor, which, for those of you listening at home, you may know that Randor in the 86 line, the King Randor action figure, was basically not the version from Filmation. I mean, he had a blue cape, which was an homage to the blue kingly jacket he wore. And while there were versions of him from the mini comics that were, more like Filmation, the figure that we actually got was kind of a battle armor King Randor, where he was, much more, armored up, you could say. And the reason for that is that Randor was part of that sort of on-the-fly, get-it-out to Store's Quick Wave that included Ninjor and Scareglow, characters with very little tooling. In fact, the only new tooling Randor had was his head, because if you notice, he's got Jitsu's armor on. It's recolored, and some people don't recognize it right away, but yeah, he's wearing Jitsu's armor, and then of course he has a soft goods cloak, which is just a purchase part. You don't need to tool the cloak. And then he had a new head, and he had the staff from Grayskull or Whiplash. So yeah, here's Jitsu for reference. You can see that without coloring those dots, it's a little hard to notice. Now, in my mind, on paper, they were going to share parts, Randor and Jitsu, in Classics, but obviously Randor got a very different sort of more kingly armor, and since Jitsu needed the back to plug the weapons into it, it meant that we couldn't do some other things because he needed new armor, which wasn't originally part of the plan. And the new things we wanted to do was, much like Fisto, we wanted to give Jitsu 2000X sort of extra parts that you could put on, whether it be an additional head or different parts of the armor. In this case specifically, it was the belt that was added by the Horsemen for their Staction figure. Again, even though he didn't make the show, he was designed and he had a Staction. And he had that really cool belt with the giant oversized rope, if you will. So that was the original plan, was to put that with Jitsu. Now we did get it out in an even cleverer way. And that is years later when we did Ninjor, we included the belt and the sort of loincloth attachment with him. But it wasn't meant for him. It worked for him perfectly. I mean, the colors completely worked for Ninjor, and if you have Ninjor and you own him, you know, you can absolutely keep that belt on him. But the intention was this belt was for Jitsu. Originally, we wanted to have him come with it, but since we had to sculpt new armor, since he couldn't use the King Randor armor like in the vintage line for both the armor or for the back weapons and the fact that Randor had a cape, and there were multiple reasons it didn't work. But that was what was in the original tooling plan, so that's why. Pretty clever solution, I thought, was getting that out with Ninjor. It was one of the cool things that made Classics so great, is putting parts out with later figures that were cross-compatible with earlier ones. And hey, whether he was fighting He-Man or Fisto, Jitsu's one of those really cool quintessential bad guys. I'm so glad to get him in Classics.